All right, we're getting to the good stuff now.
Oh, hell yeah.
Welcome back to the channel. ItsGheb here, bringing you guys another episode of our ongoing Zelda marathon. Last time we took a look at Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, which if you guys haven't given that video a watch, you definitely should. It was a pretty fun video for me to make. That being said, I admittedly wasn't the biggest fan of that game. It's definitely not bad, but I found it to be kind of unnecessarily frustrating in a few areas, and I wouldn't rank it too highly compared to some of the other Zelda games that I've played before. That's right, today we're talking about what's often considered one of the best Zelda games, or the best depending on who you ask, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. God, what a game this is. You know, I have a real soft spot for games on the Super Nintendo. I was still a little too young and a little too not conceived yet to experience it when it was the hot new thing, but man, I love games from this time. Maybe it's because I like the sound font, maybe it's because I'm a whore for pixel graphics, but it's probably because there are so many great games for the system. Super Mario World, Super Metroid, Final Fantasy 4 and 6, Super Castlevania, Mega Man X, Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, motherfucking Home Improvement. Some of gaming's biggest icons had their most notable releases on the system, and the Zelda game that we got for the SNES is no different story. At the time, people fucking loved A Link to the Past. It sold over 4.6 million copies by 2004, and while reviews are kind of scattered throughout the course of a decade and a half, the game would ultimately earn a 92% on game rankings. Speaking of which, does anyone else miss this site? Like, Metacritic is alright, but man, I really like the way that game rankings was laid out, you know? Anyways, pretty much every publication you could think of has given A Link to the Past its flowers in some way or another, whether that be on the greatest SNES games, Nintendo games, or just greatest games in general lists. Basically, anybody who's ever touched this game has walked away appreciating it to some degree, and I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I'm no different. I love this game. I had the opportunity to play A Link to the Past the way our god Shigeru Miyamoto intended, by downloading the ROM from the internet. I mean, legally purchasing it and playing it on a Nintendo console. Okay, I've done both, but let the record show that I bought it first. When I was able to get some money together and buy a game off the Virtual Console back on the Wii days, I jumped on this shit immediately. Keep in mind, I was deep into my Zelda fanboy phase, having played Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Four Swords Adventures, and Twilight Princess numerous times, and even getting a bit of experience with Zelda 1, 2, Minish Cap, Link's Awakening DX, and I think I played Phantom Hourglass by that point, but I don't know for sure. Suffice to say, I was hooked on the series at this time, and even though I didn't really care for Zelda 1 or Zelda 2 in my younger years, I looked at A Link to the Past and I thought maybe there was going to be something there that could really catch me, and when I downloaded it and played for myself, I was completely right. I played A Link to the Past after all of those games, and I still had a great time. I thought Hyrule had a ton of secrets while still being easy to get around. I thought the puzzles were super interesting and inventive, and most of all, I was shocked to see just how much stuff was really started in this game. I played through the game, 100%ed it, and as the years would go on, I would occasionally play the game here and there through emulation because, fuck you Nintendo, I don't like having to pay a subscription to play a game I don't own. So yeah, I love A Link to the Past when I first played it, but you know, the Zelda franchise is kind of in a different spot now. We've had games like A Link Between Worlds that basically took everything A Link to the Past did, but put it in a modern context. And then we've had games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom that have basically changed what Zelda means to a lot of people. So do I still have that same love for A Link to the Past like I did when I played it nearly 20 years ago? Yeah, I do. A Link to the Past, over a decade and a half after I played it, over 30 years since it originally came out, is still an amazing game. Nintendo took the ball that the first Legend of Zelda had and ran with it as far as they could. The game saw massive improvements to the story presentation, the visuals, and especially the audio. Hyrule became one of the most densely packed worlds of any video game at the time, and it's still a joy to run through today. And I think the thing I like most about this game is just how much of a breeze it is to play through. It's not super long, but you get so much crammed into a 15-hour adventure, and there's never been a point where I felt like I was lost or I needed to pull out a guide. Also, the difficulty for this is just right. Hard enough to make you pay attention in more demanding situations, but no signs of bullshit. Okay, minimal signs of bullshit. I haven't had a chance to talk about a game that I've liked this much since probably my San Andreas video, so I'm pretty stoked to talk about this one. But yeah, we've got a lot to discuss today. So without further ado, this is my review for The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. So first up we have the story, and you know, the story for the first two Zelda games was admittedly pretty bare bones, so I think you guys are going to be pretty happy to see that in A Link to the Past, we saw some pretty upped production value here. Our story actually takes place before either of the first two games, as we have a brand new Link travel throughout Hyrule to stop an evil wizard by the name of Agnem, is that how you pronounce it? His plan, capture the maidens who are descendants of the 7 sages. Link must retrieve an artifact called the Master Sword to put a stop to Agnem. But as soon as Link pulls the Master Sword out of its resting place, Agnem kidnaps Zelda. It is then revealed that his plan is to open up a rift between worlds so that Ganon can be released. Yeah, so at some point, Ganon actually claimed the full Triforce for himself, and then was able to take over what was called the Golden Land, turning it into the Dark World. And now he's trying to open a way between the 2 realms to conquer both. Agnem, for all intents and purposes, is basically just a puppet. I'm not 100% sure if he's like his own person or if he's an aspect of Ganon, but I think one of the manga expands on this a little bit. Either way, as Link, you eventually rescue the maidens, stop Ganon, and use the Triforce to turn everything back to how it was before they attacked Hyrule. You know, again, the story's not really amazing here, it's serviceable enough, but I think the real notable thing here is this is the game to establish the structure that we see in so many Zelda games after it. Yeah, this is the game that started the trend of collecting 3 MacGuffins, grabbing the Master Sword, having a plot twist, and then collecting more MacGuffins to prepare for the final showdown, with it usually being against Ganon. It's a pretty formulaic setup, but hey, it's clearly worth seeing how many games following this did the same exact thing. What I do really appreciate, especially after playing the first 2 games, is the increased production value, especially when it comes to communicating with NPCs. Now, instead of the 1-sentence text crawls whenever you see an NPC or the nonsensical bullshit that they would sometimes spew, we have some actual characters here, with real things to say and actual helpful advice to give too, look at that. Some of them even have some really funny personalities. Take for example the fortune teller, who will get a little pissy with you when you decline getting your fortune read. Sorry man, I know my chakras are already in Mercury Gatorade, I don't need to have my palms read. Or how about this imp that curses you by causing your magic power to go down by half? But he just accidentally makes us you use half as much magic instead. That's great. Or how about the guy who gets into a fight with his brother and seals him away in another room? Like, Jesus, what did he do to piss you off so much that you have him imprisoned? They really went out of their way to make these side characters really fun this time around. Link's still a silent protagonist here too, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's without his personality. This is mainly from the sprite animations he has, from hitting a wall while dashing to falling down a hole to... This is the most expressive Link we've seen so far, and it isn't even close. Shit, I mean the sprites in general in this game are fantastic, especially on some of the bosses. I mean, look at these guys. Now these are some fucking good looking monsters. I might as well touch on the sound real quick too. It's great, especially the soundtrack. There are so many memorable pieces of music here that basically everybody knows. Zelda's Lullaby, the Fairy Fountain theme, the Dark World theme, Ganon's theme, Kakariko Village. Everyone who's in the gaming knows at least one of these songs, and while some people might have been first introduced to them in something like Ocarina of Time or Super Smash Bros., they made their debut here and are fantastic pieces that have stuck with people decades after they first heard them. Koji Kondo is an absolute fucking legend. Alright, I'm getting a little sidetracked here. The graphics and sound design are fantastic. They do a great job of really making Link's adventure feel all that more grandiose. If I had to say one thing that I think A Link to the Past could have done a bit better, is that I think there maybe should have been a little bit more story in the Dark World portion of the game. Really, after Link gets dropped off there for the first time, he's just told to take on all the dungeons, and then we get drip-fed lore every time he rescues a new maiden. It's definitely okay, but something to maybe break up the trek of 8 dungeons in a row would have been nice, you know? Oh, actually one more minor complaint. Why is this game called A Link to the Past? Link doesn't even go back in time. Is it because the game is a prequel to Zelda 1? Well, apparently the Japanese title is called Triforce of the Gods, which makes a lot more sense since getting the Triforce is essentially our end goal here, but it got changed in the Western release because it had the word gods in the title. Oh, also, Aghanim was originally a priest, but got changed into a wizard. America in the late 80s and early 90s, where having something that looks like a swastika as a dungeon is okay, but having an evil priest and mentioning the word god is not. I'm just nitpicking at this point, let's wrap this section up. This game isn't Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger in the story department, but they really up the ante with everything from the storytelling, the characterization, as well as the overall presentation from the first 2 games. Everything here is a big step up, and even if it's not the most involved story in the world, I think it's at least entertaining enough that you can find some enjoyment with it. So in talking about the gameplay for A Link to the Past, it's not as much of a story as completely reworking everything, as it is taking everything that did work in Zelda 1 and running with it and improving on it in every possible way. Yeah, there really isn't a whole lot of new ground to cover as much as there is general improvements to making A Link to the Past just feel like a better Zelda 1 in almost every conceivable way. Let's start with the basic controls first. So starting off, Link now has a context-sensitive button for things like picking up items, talking to NPCs, and reading signs rather than having to hit things with his sword. Link also went from being locked to moving exclusively in cardinal directions to now being given 8 directions to move in. That might not sound like much, but I can't begin to express just how much more fluid it makes controlling Link in every single possible situation. Enemies are also granted the same freedom of movement, which can unfortunately make deflecting projectiles with your shield a little bit harder, but since it's easier to run around, you're typically better off dodging anyways. Speaking of which, let's get into the combat because it is just so much better than what we had in Zelda 1. Link actually gets a few different types of sword swings this time around. His standard attack has changed from a stab in front of him to a slash ahead of him, which again might not sound like a big deal, but this means that every standard attack covers a much wider area. The sword beam is also back, and goddamn is it so satisfying, mainly because of that noise. God, I fucking love it. The damage isn't as strong as your standard sword swings, but now it's a much larger AoE, so I think the trade-off is ultimately worth it. Then there's a new addition of the spin attack. By charging Link's sword, he can attack in the immediate area around him with a more powerful move. He can even hold that charge and run into enemies with the sword to do damage to them too. Suffice to say, the second that you take control of Link, you already have way more options than you did in either of the first 2 games, and it feels fantastic. Now, pretty early on in the game, you're gonna have the chance to travel throughout Hyrule, and again, I don't really have many complaints here. I love Hyrule in this game. There is just so much to do, the world itself has so many unique areas, and there are secrets everywhere. It's amazing. Unlike the first game, I wouldn't necessarily consider this a true open world game, since there are a lot of areas that can be blocked off until you have the means of getting to them. In a way, it almost makes Hyrule have this Metroidvania-like quality this go around, since now when you receive a new dungeon item, it usually also means that there's something new in the overworld that you are able to discover. That was kind of true with Zelda 1 to an extent, but it was mainly reserved for optional heart containers or the occasional dungeon that required an item to get to. In A Link to the Past, there are full-on sections of the map that will require things such as the hammer or the power glove in order to access. And those are just the main areas. That's not even talking about all the secrets that are littered throughout the map. There is so much stuff to find in this game, from extra rupee caches to several fairy fountains to extra chests for restocking Link's supplies. To me, Hyrule kind of feels smaller than the first 2 games, but it's condensed in a way that it makes it so there's usually a secret somewhere that you are. All you have to do is find it. And these secrets are far, far more manageable to find this go around. Bombable walls will now have cracks in them to show that you can blow them up. Things you can destroy will be put in weird spots that will make you want to investigate them. Basically, all the trial and error stuff from the first game is now clearly communicated to the player. It's just so much better. There's also never a point where you really need to ask yourself where you need to go, since all of your objectives are marked on your map. And if you're still having trouble, you can always go to the fortune teller who can point you in the right direction. You really don't need a guide for this one unless you're trying to like 100% the game or something, and even then, I don't think it's completely necessary. Hyrule this time around has so many unique areas to visit too, as well as some updated ones that we saw in the first 2 games. For example, the Lost Woods. Now this time it actually feels like a twisty and confusing maze of trees. Or how about Death Mountain? Now rather than the series of caves, it feels like we actually are traveling up a dangerous mountain because of the added elevation. The new areas are also some real winners for me, and a lot of them would come back in numerous Zelda games. Kakariko Village, Hyrule Castle, Lake Hylia, these have all come back time and time again, and they made their debut here, and you know, they're super identifiable locations. What else can you say? Of course, there's all the new dungeons, and surprise, surprise, they kick ass too. Each one is centered around a theme aesthetically, as well as having a higher emphasis on combat and puzzles. Now, instead of the dungeons just being different colored variations of each other with slightly different layouts, each one has its own sense of identity, such as the Desert Palace having sandy floors, or Swamp Palace requiring some waterways to be open. Now, the combat is much easier this time around given the sheer versatility that Link has in his kit, but I would still say that A Link to the Past is a bit harder than your average Zelda game, especially when you get to some of the late game dungeons. Things can definitely kill you pretty quick if you're not careful, nothing to the level of Zelda 2 or even Zelda 1, but I think it's definitely more demanding than something like Wind Waker or Minish Cap. I think the difficulty mainly comes not from the enemies or bosses necessarily, even though some of them can catch you off guard, but just from all the obstacles that you find within the dungeons themselves. Falling floors, rooms filled with spikes, turrets constantly shooting lasers at you. This is where you're going to take all that chip damage. That might be the thing that does you in when you get to the boss room. But yeah, enemies and bosses this go around aren't too challenging, but there are a couple difficulty spikes to be aware of. Mainly during the beginning of the game when some enemies can hit you for 2 hearts of damage when you still have low health. and when you first begin exploring the Dark World. Enemies still have a lot of their own gimmicks and weaknesses, such as Gibdos being weak to fire, and the bosses started to implement more of the dungeon items as being a requirement to take them down. Not everyone requires their particular dungeon item, but most do require some sort of mini puzzle in order to solve how to beat them. The Helmazar King needs to be hit with the hammer or bombs, Trinex needs to be hit with the right elemental rod, and even the first boss fight with Agnem sees us have the first instance of energy tennis in the series. For the most part, all these pose a pretty fair challenge. Yeah, for the most part. The boss fights with Moldorm or the final encounter with Ganon where they can knock your ass off the platform and you have to start the fight over, pretty annoying. Then we have the higher emphasis on puzzles, which I think is the biggest step up that we see from the first game's dungeons. Every dungeon will typically revolve around a couple of different puzzle ideas, such as flipping switches, riding a cart around the room while performing other actions, pushing blocks in certain directions to get to new areas. Hell, you could say the general navigation is a puzzle too, actually. The dungeons this time around have so much depth. Instead of a series of flat rooms being connected by doors in cardinal directions, now every single dungeon has multiple floors to traverse and even has pits which can lead you down into some of the lower levels. And I think those are my favorite types of dungeons, since it requires the player to think about them as if they were in a 3D space, and I think that is such a cool idea. The only real blemish I have when it comes to the game's dungeons is probably the Ice Palace. I hate ice physics, and while Link to the Past doesn't have the worst ones that I've seen, I still don't like it. You know, I'm not a big fan of Skull Woods either. Like, it's cool to have a dungeon where you can occasionally go outside or has multiple entrances, but Skull Woods has so many needless areas that you just kind of end up skipping. Most of the other dungeons are great though, with my personal favorite being Thieves Town, since I like that you can find the boss room right away, but you have to actually figure out how to activate the fight by escorting somebody to the room while also shining a light from the room above. So yeah, the dungeons are great. And much like Zelda 1, when you get to the Dark World, you can kind of do some sequence breaking to do some things out of order. However, I wouldn't say it's as freeform as Zelda 1, with most of the dungeons needing a certain item to be completed. Zelda 1 had a couple of instances where you needed an item from an earlier dungeon to progress, but here it feels a little bit more restrictive. It's still certainly possible with a lot more veteran players choosing to do certain dungeons first to get things like an early sword upgrade, but there are also times where you'd need to leave a dungeon with a particular item if you wanted to do something first, and I don't know about you guys, but that always just feels wrong, you know? The option is still there if you can get your hands on that item, and my god, how many items there are. Look at all this shit. Your items really fall into two categories: stuff that Link always has on, and active items that need to be equipped. The items that Link always has on are things that we already saw in Zelda 1 for the most part: a better sword for more damage, multicolored tunics for increased defenses, and shield upgrades. That aren't really too useful if I'm being honest, these are kinda lame. Some of the new additions include the Power Glove, which allow Link to lift up heavy objects and throw them, which is honestly one of my favorite ways to kill goons, since it does a good amount of damage, and it's just kind of funny watching Link kill stuff with a big ass rock or a jar. Then there's the Zora Flippers, which finally give Link the ability to swim, which is kind of cool, but you don't really do too much with them. And finally, we have the Pegasus Boots, giving Link the ability to dash straight ahead at blistering speeds and damaging anything in his way. I use these all the time for traversal, and sometimes it's just fun seeing how big of a straightaway you can get going. Next, we have the active items, and what a lineup we have this time around. Returning from Zelda 1, we have your staples, such as the Boomerang, which is just as good as it was, and the Bow and Bombs, which I didn't use too much in the first game since I wanted to hold on to them in case I needed them, but with A Link to the Past letting you upgrade the capacity to an absurdly high amount if you give this fairy enough rupees, and the fact that the game is constantly showering you with money, you can expect to basically never run out of these. We also see the return of the flute, allowing Link to fast travel to certain areas in the light world, which is always great to have. And now into the new shit, and Link has so many new things to play around with. And it might be kind of surprising to you, the thing that I find most useful is actually the empty bottle. You get 4 of these throughout the game, and you just essentially put shit in them. The main thing that you're going to want to put in these are fairies and blue potions though. Fairies will automatically heal you if you die, but can also be released to restore a bit of health. And blue potions are phenomenal. You drink them and they completely refill your health and magic. I recommend stocking up on these basically before every single dungeon. For some of the more physical based items, we have things like the Bug Net, which is mostly used for catching fairies, but you can also use it to meme on Aghanim if you want. Then there's the book, which essentially is used to translate a few things, but then basically just takes up space after you use it where it's needed. Then there's the hammer, which you can damage enemies with, but its range is shorter than my dick, so there's really no point in trying to use it unless it's a requirement for damaging a particular enemy. It's mainly used for clearing out obstacles, so it might actually be the most underwhelming item in the game. Also, I hate the noise that this thing makes. It's so unimpactful, it sounds like someone just dropped a solo cup on the ground. Finally, there's the hook shot. Probably one of the most well-known Zelda items makes its debut here, and it's a fucking great thing to have. You can use it offensively to damage enemies from afar, you can use it to pull yourself towards certain objects. You get a lot of utility out of this thing, plus it's a fucking grappling hook. Every game that gets a grappling hook is immediately better. Just look at Doom Eternal.
But wait! There's more!
Yeah, that's right. We also have a bunch of items that use this funny little magic meter up here, and these are some of the best items in the game if I'm being honest. We'll get the lamest one out of the way first, the lantern. You can use it to light torches. Woo. You'll definitely get a bit of use out of it, but it's really not the greatest thing ever. Speaking of, we have the magic powder. This is something you can sprinkle on enemies to change them into something else. Not the greatest thing in the world when you can typically just kill them, though you are able to change the anti-fairies into regular fairies by doing this, which is honestly really helpful, especially in the late game dungeons. Next up are the ice and fire rods. These shoot a projectile of the particular element out in a direction. They both have their uses, like the ice rod being one of the strongest early game weapons, and the fire rod having some utility in some of the late game dungeons. Then there's the canes. The blue one giving Link some invulnerability while also damaging enemies he touches, and the red one being able to break the game in half if you get it early enough, since it can create blocks to bypass puzzles. I fucking love this thing. Then there's the magic cape, which lets Link turn invisible and bypass basically every obstacle. Not sure how he still casts a shadow while he's invisible, but I digress. And finally, we have the medallions, which all basically act as a screen nuke, with the Bombos medallion being the best of the three. The magic consumption is so minimal for these two, so I think it's always worth throwing it out unless you are desperately trying to save on resources. My god, that was a lot of shit, and it kind of goes without saying that this is easily the most versatile Link that we've seen so far. He basically has everything he had from Zelda 1, and even a bit of stuff that he had in Zelda 2, plus much, much more. This is where I think we really get to see Link being considered more of the Swiss Army knife of video game protagonists, since he always has a tool for the job. One last thing I'll cover before we get into the game's main gimmick, and that's the introduction of heart pieces. The first two games had Link find full-on heart containers out in the world, but A Link to the Past shakes things up by splitting those containers up into quarters, so you can do 4 times the amount of work to get them. I kid, these are a great change, mainly because they really let Nintendo stretch their wings on their side activities. Now you'll still have the exploration pieces that you can find, but some will also be earned by completing minigames. Not all of these are that great, particularly the RNG dependent ones, like the chest selecting minigame that thankfully I was fortunate enough to find the piece on the second attempt. I did not have as much luck with the digging minigame though. This one honestly kinda sucks. Collecting the heart pieces would be improved on in later entries of the series, but overall, this is a big step in the right direction for creating meaningful side content to do. And here I was thinking this was going to be a quick run through of all the things that A Link to the Past improved on from Zelda 1, but, you know, you get me talking about a game that I love and I just don't know when to shut up. I'll wrap up this section of the video by saying, A Link to the Past is the game that really set up what Zelda is in a lot of people's minds, and I think it's really great for the most part. I don't really have major complaints here. Another trope that A Link to the Past established that a lot of the other mainline Zelda games use is the fact that it's the same exact formula that's built around a central gimmick. So in this game, you really have 2 overworlds to explore, the Light World and the Dark World. Now the Light World is your standard Hyrule experience that you're probably familiar with if you played any Zelda game before. But by finding these portals in the Light World, Link is able to travel to the Dark World. Now what exactly is the Dark World? Well, think about it as a second map to explore that features new and more challenging enemies, a different set of NPCs, and a bunch of new dungeons to explore. In order to progress with the second half of the game, Link needs to travel back and forth between the Light World and the Dark World in order to gather items and open more dungeons. I think the most interesting thing is that the Dark World is basically an inverted version of Hyrule as opposed to its own sort of thing. And when I say inverted version of Hyrule, I mean the layout is basically 1-to-1. But there are a couple of notable differences. First off, obviously being the vibe. The Dark World is a realm that has been conquered by Ganon, and Ganon must be the type of guy to not water his lawn during the summer because everything here is either dead or in a state of disarray. Secondly, while a lot of the geography line up between the 2 worlds, sometimes the differences are what make them feel more impactful. Like Kakariko Village almost being a safe haven in the Light World turns into Thieves Town, which is anything but. Or the Lost Woods being turned into the Skull Woods that has a much more grim atmosphere. Then there's some even larger scale changes, like changing the desert area in the Light World into a swamp in the Dark World. The Dark World also alters NPCs into animalistic versions of themselves, and even Link turns into a bunny if he doesn't have the Moon Pearl in his inventory. Why does he turn into a rabbit? I have no fucking idea. Now, as I said a second ago, Link is going to need to go back and forth between these two worlds in order to progress, so how does he go about doing that? Well, entering and exiting the Dark World is a two-part piece. In order to enter the Dark World, Link will have to uncover a portal somewhere in the Light World so he can be transported over. These are dotted around the map, and you should find them pretty naturally. When in the Dark World and you're wanting to return to the Light World, Link will have to use the magic mirror item that will place him in the equivalent spot in the Light World if you were to overlap the two maps. In the rare instance that Link teleports onto some collision, he will thankfully be booted back so you can try again. This will also leave a new portal on the ground that Link can return to if he wishes to come back to the Dark World. Side note, yes, I know that the mirror can be used to teleport to the entrance if you use it in the dungeon. I feel like if I didn't say something about that, I would get like 50 comments all saying that I didn't know that, so just a quick reminder to you guys. Just because I don't say something in the video doesn't mean I don't know it exists. But back on topic. So yeah, traveling to and from the Dark World is honestly one of the coolest fucking mechanics that I can think of from a game released at this time. Sometimes there are areas that are completely inaccessible in the Dark World, which will require you traveling to the Light World in an attempt to find a way around. Sometimes you might see a piece of heart or an inaccessible ledge in the Light World that by traveling to the Dark World and using the mirror, you'll be able to get them. There's even an instance where you do something in the Light World that had an equal effect on things in the Dark World, which is so fucking cool. But I really wish they did more with it. I think this mechanic is a bit underutilized in this game. Like, what's here is great, especially with some of the heart pieces. Looking at you, heart piece you get near the end of Turtle Rock, what a pain in the ass you were to find. But I think there could have been a little bit more done with manipulating things in the Light World to have an effect on the Dark World. Like, imagine if there was a maze that had its path revealed in the Light World that you would have to navigate in the Dark World through a series of false walls. Or how about if we had a boss fight that had you switch back and forth between the two realms to contend with certain mechanics? I'm sure there were some technical limitations that definitely played a part into this, but I just can't help but feel there was a little bit of wasted potential here, and if we got a little bit more interaction between the two worlds, I think this game could have been even better than it already was. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is where the series as we know it really begins in my eyes. While the first Zelda laid the groundwork for a lot of important features, such as the focus on items, dungeons, bosses, and secrets, A Link to the Past acts as a skeleton for the series, where pretty much every game that came out after it was still following that formula. The Master Sword, items like the hookshot, the plot structure, several key locations like Hyrule Castle and Kakariko Village, tons of memorable music, moves like the spin attack. They all got their start here, and they've all been in pretty much every game since. I love the dungeon's new emphasis on puzzles, all the new optional content available to do, and the Dark World mechanic, while not as fleshed out as I think it could be, is still fantastic. This game gets a very high recommendation from me. I think it's the perfect game for newcomers to the Zelda franchise to get their start, or if it's even been a minute, I think you should really consider booting this one up. It's definitely worth your time. This game isn't perfect, but man, it's pretty damn close. And you know what the crazy thing is? I probably wouldn't even put A Link to the Past in my top 5 Zelda games. You know we have a stacked ass marathon when we have a game this fucking good that I don't even think belongs in the top 5. We're in for some good games coming up, so I hope you guys stick with me. Well, that's all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you for watching. What was your favorite memory of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider giving it a like and subscribing. Thank you guys again. I'll catch you in the next video.